What, if anything, would you consider to be heresy?
Well, you're the one that wanted to jump ahead.
Well, I didn't actually want to, but I thought it was inevitable. I mean, heresy only exists in contrast to so-called orthodoxy.
Is that right?
Yeah, and heresy is usually extrinsic offense. Yeah.
So something that's diabolical isn't necessarily heretical.
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
Because it's a matter of doctrine. So, no, not necessarily. There is no necessary overlap.
So whatever it is that's heretical has to be seen so from within a particular doctrinal universe.
Correct. I mean, we can use the term more commonly for anybody that, believes or says something you think is beyond the pale. But no, it has to be in contrast to something.
What actually does the word mean? What's the etymology?
Well, I don't know. Let's see. All right. We'll go to the Ultimate Authority Wiktionary. Middle English heresy, Old French heresy, Latin heresis, Greek hieresis, which means choice system of principles, from hareomai in Greek, to take for oneself to choose. So it means going your own way, basically.
Okay.
In religion, a doctrine held by a member of a religion at variance with established beliefs.
Right. That was the first place you went, yes.
And, secondarily, a controversial or unorthodox opinion, as in philosophy, politics, science. So, what's heresy in principle depends on what religious or spiritual or traditional world you live in. But that doesn't relativize away that which heresy is intended to combat. In other words, it doesn't mean there is no such thing, and that there's never evil in something that's called heretical. So I don't know what I would consider heretical.
Because, go ahead.
I'd say for me, being a pure materialist is heresy.
Mm-hmm.
But not every heretic needs to be tortured and punished.
Well, but even that, a materialist is a heretic only from a transcendental viewpoint.
That's right. But I think the question says, what would I consider heresy? So in my universe, I think that's heresy, along with a number of nothing more-isms.
Well, I don't care much for materialism myself.
Yeah.
But are we now down to the point of heresy as I don't care for?
Well, sometimes it boils down to that, especially in a very hierarchical spiritual environment. But, most of the time these doctrines are based on something, and they're not, So, they have some validity. So if you find yourself engaged in something called heresy, you might want to re-examine it and make sure and decide who the heretic really is.
Well, but it's still with reference to a particular framework.
Yes, it has to be. I think it's choice, system of principles is what they say the Greek root means. So you need the system of principles, and you have to make the wrong choice, or the unofficial choice. If we mean intrinsic heresy, then it's another whole story. And I sort of put materialism there, but sometimes it results from a lack of imagination rather than ill will.
Well, is there finally a truth that transcends these definitions?
Well, of course.
That can be a basis for a heresy?
Well, if what you're doing influences or encourages someone, to travel toward perdition, then it might be intrinsically heretical, because the transcendent principle is definitely not a place that you are condemned to.
Right.
So you're doing evil if it's called a heresy, send somebody in the dark direction.
I say bring on the heresy, but bring on the heresy as a way to achieve that which the Orthodox say heresy inhibits. But in fact, heresy simply, by the standard definition, is that which goes against orthodoxy. And, orthodoxy, often the way it's wielded like a hammer, ends up stifling free thought, whereas heresy can imbibe freedom of thought within someone and actually be a great impetus towards good things, as long as one isn't a heretic just to be a heretic. Because this is something people don't often see, is that sometimes when you go against the grain, if you do it in a mechanical way and do just the opposite of the orthodox, you're just as mechanical as the orthodox are. So I say, sure, bring on the heresy. Let's be heretics. Let's be heretics the way some of the great mystics were heretics. Let's be heretics.
Like Meister Eckhart.
Yeah, or Kabir, or the Zen master that called the Buddha a stick of shit. But, let's get down to the fact here that, for me, one of my favorite religions is Tibetan Buddhism, and one of my least favorite religions is Tibetan Buddhism. Because, if you look at really vital early Tibetan Buddhism, it's so wonderful. It's really so very experiential, and it's really transcending these boundaries of law and order and theology. But if you look at Tibetan Buddhism of the last few centuries, it's the exact opposite. It's the most stifling mountain of obfuscation that any religion has hitherto come to. It's just really just a lot of dogma, and it stifles the thought. And that's why I think in the last few hundred years you haven't had these great figures in Tibetan Buddhism like you had earlier. And I hope all of that makes sense, considering I just traveled for 11 hours and City Talk. I don't think you were here when I said it, but I just got in the door about a half an hour ago.
Good timing.
Good timing.
It shows how much you care about participating.
Yes.
You traveled so far to get here. Well, the kind of heresy you're talking about, which I approve of wholeheartedly, is basically, if you want to really understand the doctrine or the dogma, you have to be able to say, well, on the other hand, and if you can't do that, at least in a discussion, then the dogma is suspect.
Is there not an esoteric, exoteric measure to be imposed here? Because on the one hand, freedom of thought is essential for really understanding, and that includes posing opposite points of view than that which is established, in order to push the boundaries of what one knows and maybe what one is known. On the other hand, you can't run a society on that principle.
Well, no. Our system of laws is, it's pretty much provisional doctrine, provisional dogma, because it arises in response to situations. So, for the esoterist, the exoterist could be considered a heretic, but I think I would tell the esoterist that he maybe needs to be a little more esoteric.
I'm confused.
Oh, I said, from an esoteric point of view, exoterism is heresy.
Yes, understood.
So then you have to suspect just how much someone is actually a more interior or more holistic or more universal. So, if it's too easy for an esoterist to say exotericism is heresy, then that esoterist might want to look, might want to question his notion of orthodoxy.
I would also say, it depends on the individual. On the one hand, I'm all for Swami Vivekananda's injunction that if there's 1 billion people in the world, there should be 1 billion religions. But realistically, there's always going to be the masses, and the masses need something organized, something social, something with laws and rights and order, and they have no interest nor the capacity to build their own faith. So ultimately, while Swami Vivekananda was right, he's only right for the religious elite.
Yeah, or he's only right with regard to a spiritual path, which is going to be somehow different for each person. But that's different from a religion. And I think that people, the elite or whatever, who basically get it, basically understand, basically embody the truth, should compromise a little bit for the sake of those who don't have the ability. And I think that's really where exotericism comes from. Questions, you can't answer from the spiritual realm, but, they seem to need an answer.
So, would you like to sum that up, someone?
Well, who is the someone who's going to sum it up?
Well, so have we gotten anywhere beyond heresy is that which can only be defined with respect to a particular orthodoxy or conceptual universe?
No, I don't think.
Accepted system of knowledge.
Well, except the notion of, intrinsic heresy, which would have to be something opposed to the good, but whatever form is used to express that is always going to be somewhat relative.
Okay. Seda Zainab, we've not heard from you yet.
Yes, because, when we started this discussion, we looked up what heresy, where it comes from. And what came to my sight was a definition from Oxford Dictionary and an example of it. And it says, cutting capital gains taxes is heresy. And I just laughed because anything can be made into heresy.
Sure.
So long it opposes something that's been done for centuries and traditions, one has to ask themselves, what is the actual intent behind it?
Yeah.
So apparently someone must have submitted this example to Oxford Dictionary, but when I read it, cutting capital gains taxes is heresy. I wonder where that is coming from.
Yes, and I wonder why there is a descriptive term called the religious right.
Right.
Or the religious left. I mean, that's more of a left position to point that out. But the people who actually think increasing taxes is heresy, I guess, that would be the religious right. So I got that wrong.
Anyway, let's try to narrow the focus down and say, what would heresy within the Tariqa look like?
I like anything modern and popular.
I was thinking a little bit more along the lines of disparaging the divine name.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mean, there's different kinds of orthodoxy and different kinds of heresy. So yeah, if the modern world has to be bad and you are not so sure about that, you may be a heretic. But whether you're a sinner is another story.
Yes, that is a different story.
There is no necessary overlap between what's called heresy and, well, whatever. I lost the word, but I think that's
a word?
Well, yes, the next word in that sentence disappeared, so never mind.
Well, I mean, okay, if you try to articulate a position that you would consider to be heretic, chances are that I probably hold that position. So there's that. But on the other hand, maybe my position is that it all comes down to, within the context of the Tariqa, what you mentioned earlier, Sidi Talha, materialism. There's all sort of room for a lot of things, really almost anything. And I say, let's open it up to all sorts of different heretical propositions. But the one thing that I think cannot be accepted is Sufi materialism.
Well, it certainly is a contradiction.
Well, actually, there is something to be said for spiritual materialism. Talk about an oxymoron, but there. But when I say materialism, I don't mean that. I mean the gross form of materialism.
Yeah.
Right.
Almost anything can be spiritualized. It's just that not everything is spiritual the way other things are, to the extent that other things are. I think we need heresy. Without having a place for heresy, I think, a spiritual tradition would probably ossify and lose its efficacy. But there has to be a place to say something that sounds heretical in order that you can really consider it, so that there's actual intellectual conversation or actual participation in understanding the truth.
Yes, participation.
If you just want to, lash out at somebody because they wore the wrong color of turban, who's the heretic there?
Conversely, since maybe it's a bit hard to narrow down exactly what, in our context, heresy would be, let's switch it around and say, in the context of our tariqa, what is orthodoxy?
Well, in our tariqa, orthodoxy is something that doesn't close off the infinite. That would be kind of a first principle, kind of like materialism, although you can think quantitatively about an infinite universe.
We're defining orthodoxy here, right?
That's what I thought.
Okay, go on.
Well, given that it's a tariqa, given that it's in particular our tariqa, it ought to allow a whole lot more so that very few things would necessarily be heretical.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, universalists, if we accept more than one religion, somewhere along the line, doctrine is going to contradict one and the other.
Right.
So we have to have a high tolerance for what might be called heresy.
Well, I think we're probably pretty good at defining, defending, or not defending heresy in other forms. But what about within our own?
Well, considering something heresy is optional, you could say what's helpful and what's hurtful. If it's useless and counter to the purpose of your spiritual journey, that's all you need to know. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have that conflict between orthodoxy and heresy. Just try to see the thing for what it is. If it helps one person but not another, then, maybe it's not heresy for one and heresy for the other. I think there's an element of intent that I would like to think is somewhere behind something that I would call heretical. And if you can't think outside the framework, then don't claim to have free will. If all you can do is follow the script, well...
I mean, you could say, what's heretical? He is Allah one, needed by none. He had many children. After being born, he begot and is begotten, and many are comparable to him.
Well, yes, that would run afoul of some people.
Yes.
But we should ask, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, most of the time we can't at all be sure that we know what the other person means. We figure it out pretty well, but we don't have that inherent ability. So, didn't they wait until Meister Eckhart was dead before they excommunicated him?
That I don't know. Is that?
That may be. I'm not quite sure. There's something about what happened before or after his death. I think after he was no longer able to defend himself, he got declared a heretic.
Well, that's heretical.
Yeah.
And a contemporary of Eckhart, one of the greatest mystics in the Christian tradition, someone who few people know about, which is sort of sad because she is, in my opinion, just as good as Eckhart, is Marguerite Porete. But they counted her a heretic and burned her alive. But she burned with a smile on her face.
That's a good sign.
What is the role of eroticism in religious practice?
You take heresy. I'll keep the eroticism.
Then say something about it.
Well, it's one of those things that works both as a symbol and as a practice.
That's right. Because it's in the direction of bliss or transcendence.
Right. It's an explication of the two becoming one.
Yes, it is. And also, there have been people that say that they've been ravished by Christ or the Holy Spirit. And, that kind of language, while some may wince at it, really points to a pretty profound experience.
Yes, and so much religious and spiritual literature and poetry is in the love metaphor.
That's right.
Eroticism also has the quality of loss of ego.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case.
No, not necessarily.
It points in that direction.
It's certainly possible. Yeah, eroticism has a lot going for it.
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. There's something inherently erotic about closeness and oneness with the beloved.
Right.
And it's such an intrinsically positive thing that one is going to think about it. One is going to perhaps talk about it. So, yeah, eroticism, I mean, of course, it can be unbalanced.
Of course.
And often is, but that doesn't destroy the meaning of it itself.
No, and it's a powerful metaphor and practice and celebration.
And it's outside the head.
Yes, that's right. Very good. That's exactly right.
It's more about emotion and sensation, which makes it pretty darn experiential.
Yes, and pretty profound. I just happen to have been reading some erotic poetry lately. Just so happens.
You're a heretic.
I guess by some measures I am. But in my own defense, I know the author.
Well, I don't think that would float if you were talking to the Inquisition, but it can work with me.
Except that I'm married to her.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I assumed that's who you meant.
Well, particular Inquisition isn't in town today, I'm pleased to say. So, wait a minute, we haven't heard from other voices here. Did Zainab?
We seem to be still on the topic of heresy, and I don't know what more can be said than what we have said already, but I feel ultimately it all comes down to the intention. Like, if one desire is to be a heretic, then what's causing that desire? What's the intent behind it?
Right. Yeah, because what's called heresy is the manifestation of something.
Yes, well said.
I would say that creation is erotic. I would say that all eroticism, all eros, is cosmogonic. The creation of the world, all of separation from the one, is erotic because the initial unity, the one, contained within it all things. And that love for creation separated itself into multiplicity. That one contained the love of creation. And for Eros, the boundless universe is alive, not a dead thing, it's alive. And when that broke through, a flood of shimmering light breaks forth, and the entire environment glows, and distance resounds, and the beloved becomes a flame afar. This is what it means. It's not about something, it's not about what the diminished term means, though it also encompasses that. Ultimately, the good Tibetan Buddhists had it right, that this is an essential part of the spiritual practice. And even the love of God or the gods or creation or the earth or a tree is erotic, and it should be so. And those figures from Christianity and Islam and other religions, the Taliban or the fundamentalists or the Inquisition, that try to stifle this are not just stifling a fundamental part of human nature, but they're stifling the will of God.
Well, yes, and in a certain sense, there's a certain idolatry in there.
Yes.
And so, to come back to orthodoxy versus heresy, I would say the greater person is in their orthodoxy, the more of a heretic they are.
Well, yeah, the more rigid it is.
Yes.
Well, and let's face it, the cosmogonic act is a celebration.
Yes.
Is an expression of love.
And its substance is love.
Right, exactly. And its continued existence is love.
So, next one is, if someone has a sheikh or a guru who is acting unethically, how should they proceed?
Well, I think that Sheikh al-Bashir has wrote about this in his book Here.Now.One, and ultimately it's up to the seeker's discernment. They have to use their own discernment about what is right and what is wrong. And if someone as a sheikh or a guru is acting unethically, then they really have to question what they're getting out of that teacher, and if it makes sense to continue with that teacher. The teacher is not supposed to be a perfect being. They're teaching something, but they're not expected to be a perfect being. And I think a lot of these problems arises when the disciples of the teacher or the followers of the teacher expects that teacher to be a perfect being.
Right. And ideally, in a situation like that, You would simply be able to matter-of-factly ask the sheikh about his behavior.
Yes, and even if you were disturbed by his answer, you might have enough space to say, well, he's a great teacher, but he's not perfect. He's still a person, and he actually has this particular flaw, but his teaching is still accurate and helpful.
Yes, that can happen, obviously.
There's a tremendous tendency to absolutize things and see them all in black and white, but things are really not so much that way.
But what if Sheikh is such a problem that they are, let's say, deluded to the fact that they're a problem? What if they're approaching members with healing hands, quote unquote, and they refuse the advice or offers of help or whatnot from the fuqara? What does the community do then?
Well, if the sheikh won't discuss it or insists that it's, absolutely appropriate, he's moving in the direction of taking himself to be perfect, and to not allow for the possibility that one's behavior is having a troubling or negative effect on others. That, to be unwilling to consider that is, a pretty big flaw.
Well, what if he's just convinced of his absolute rightness?
Yeah, well.
What if, for example, he were to go so far as giving a fatwa declaring jihad against people of his own tariqah?
Yeah. Well, you don't have to go along with that.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Well, to go back to Eros, there's this quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Ludwig Klages, and he says, "We can liken sex to the harsh light of a glowing electric wire. Eros, however, is more like the intense and frosty shimmer of opalescent glass. Erotic vitality resembles an elegant lamp that discharges its radiance symmetrically throughout one's entire life." So true, but also when you see one of these sheikhs or gurus or whatnot that have descended and are not following their own path any longer, I feel like they're discharging that harsh kind of electric aura from themselves. It doesn't mean they weren't always good at one point, but someone can change from having the flicker of a candle flame to that harsh, bright kind of spotlight. And I've seen this happen with people in my life, that this has happened, and it's a real problem. It's something maybe that I'm dwelling on here and asking because it's one of the true universals that whether we're talking about Islam or Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism or Taoism or any other thing, we have seen too many examples of narcissistic leaders of faith communities who have created cults of personality and have abused their members. And I'm just wondering here, what's the strongest reaction that we could give to try to, solve this?
You mean if we find that happening at home or in the
Well,
world?
I mean, obviously we can't solve other people's problems, but I'm saying not so much at home, but let's say someone is listening to one of these podcasts and they're experiencing some problem with their teacher, considering that at home we've had our own experiences of certain things. What, given your experience, would your advice to be to John Doe or Jane Doe?
If it has become a cult of personality, find another guide.
Yeah. It's like,
because once it becomes a cult of personality, it's a pretty steep slope.
Yeah, it can fall fast. And the master in this case is in delusion if he thinks that, he has rubbed out every little bit of narcissism. Some of that comes with a package for everybody.
Well, it's a matter of proportion, because to the degree that the group is still about the purpose for which it was formed, which is spiritual progress, it may still be valid. To the degree that it has all become about him or her, it's no longer valid.
That's right.
May have a lot of good sounding words, but there you have it.
The truth is impersonal.
That's right.
Experience of it is always personal, or at least it's on the subject side of the equation. Yeah, I mean,
And again, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There may be people who can get a lot out of a particularly self-interested narcissistic guru, or for a while, or there's something about what he or she has to offer that's valuable, again, maybe for a while.
Yeah, I mean, the person can be good in a lot of things while not being so good in, one or a couple of things.
Right, exactly.
And, that's the whole thing of the imperfect vessel.
Yes.
But, if the imperfection gets to be a whole lot like Donald Trump, then basically it's the case of the emperor's new vessel.
Well said. Say to Zainab, are we making sense?
Yes, we are.
Well, I'm remembering the experience of, being told that the master's personality is just that. It's personal, and the past has nothing to do with it, only to hear later on that the master's personality is really, really important. That's, that point at which the contradiction was too big for me.
Yeah. Can you say that again?
That, the change from relativizing the personality of the teacher in favor of the doctrine, the teaching, and the method, then, if it changes from that and the emphasis goes on to the personality, then, that's choosing something relative over something, transcendent.
Yes.
And I think someone in that situation needs to ask themselves, if the sheikh has an annoying habit, how important is that? And, does it make it impossible to get the benefit of the teaching?
Right.
In which case, if it is possible to get the benefit, then one of the benefits you can get is to stop identifying with your annoyance. Or, in other words, don't you make the mistake of elevating some aspect of the teacher's personality. He's so important. It goes both ways.
Yes, and it's also important for the seeker or traveler to really understand what it is he or she wants.
That's right.
Because so often I've seen people, what they really want is a sense of identity and connectedness, and that can be provided by a cult.
Yes. If you base your identity, well, on anything really, but practically speaking, if you get your sense of worth from the fact that you're connected with this wonderful person who teaches the truth, then, you're already a little off balance.
Mm-hmm.
You can be grateful that you've encountered the teaching, but what does it have to do with you? It's quiet.
No, I'm thinking about that question, which is a good one.
In other words, if the apparent contradiction or conflict is between two personalities, then, like the concern about what might be the flaw on one side is the same as the concern about the flaw on the other side. And why would you choose to be unnecessarily, opposed to something to the extent that it messes with your spiritual state? Why? Now, if something's wrong, and you have to make that discernment, and you might make the wrong conclusion and stay around a little longer or leave and then come back. But, you do have to use it, and you do have to examine carefully and respond with understanding. And there's a place for calling out the guru, but generally not publicly, unless it's really egregious and you can't bring it up. And if, whatever it is has become too important to the guru, then, well, maybe look somewhere else.
Yes, I think you stated very well. Other comments?
I was just going to say a sign of attachment to the guru as a person is almost like a warning signal that it's time to detach.
Good.
What was the first part of that?
A sign of attachment is a warning for detachment.
Yeah, yes. a lot of the spiritual path has to do with, what you identify with, because ultimately you have to find out there is no you. So
the only thing I would add is that ultimately, if someone's on the path, their loyalty is not to a person. It's not to a sheikh or a master or a guru. It's to the truth. It's to the true, the beautiful, and the good. And that supersedes any loyalty one may feel towards a master. It doesn't mean that one still cannot be loyal to them, even if they're acting unethically, but that loyalty has to be the loyalty of a friend to a friend, not the loyalty of a student to a master, because as soon as that master stops performing their function properly and goes against the true, the good, and the beautiful, that master loses their right to have the student follow them.
Yeah.
As soon as they become a heretic.
Yes, of course.
Well, I mean, also, just in terms of the definition, technically, the master gets to determine orthodoxy within a community. So if they're acting unethically, the best thing to do is to have all of the followers become heretics and separate from the master. And that's the thing. That's the thing about heresy and orthodoxy. It's a dialectic. More often than not, it's not black and white. It's shades of gray. You have the thesis of orthodoxy, the antithesis of heresy, but it ends up becoming a synthesis of ortho-heresy. And that becomes the new orthodoxy, and so on and so forth in an eternal cycle, which is as it should be.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, there is the play of opposites, even though there aren't two. Everything being related in some way to everything else. It's going to be living in dynamic.
Oh, yes, certainly.
For instance, you can't control when Mercury goes retrograde, but you may have a strong connection to it.
Is that happening soon?
I don't know. I haven't looked recently. I know that the last time I thought it must be, it wasn't.